I'm Chris Chinchilla. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Welcome to another Chinchilla Squeak with me, Chris Chinchilla. Back to interviews, clearing the backlog of the past few weeks. I'm actually squashing two vaguely related interviews into this episode from the Open Source Summit in Bilbao. And I'm going to be speaking with, no surnames in both these cases, with Max from the Sustainability TAG, Technical Advisory Group with the CNCF, and with Arpit, who heads up the Energy Linux Foundation groups, shall we say. We sort of dig into exactly what that means in the interview. But before all that, I actually do have quite a few very mostly related bits of news and links to go through. So let's jump into those first. This is something from Patrick Howell O'Neill over on MIT Technology Review about how the US military would like to understand the most important software on Earth. Now, what might be that most important software on Earth, I hear you say? Well, it is the Linux kernel. And I think this is mostly from a security perspective when so much software and hardware is reliant on this piece of software. People who are reliant on it would sort of like to understand how it works, should there ever be a need to dig into that detail for protection reasons, for security reasons, etc., etc. And this has got military and other security groups spooked, interested. I don't know quite what the right word is, because of course, being open source, it means that people can access the code and figure out ways to potentially exploit anything using it and not tell anybody, because there is no one they have to tell if they're exploiting it in a black hat way, I suppose. So a lot of experts inside these organizations want to understand it better so they can identify those potential exploits themselves and, I guess, fix them before they are exploited for other people, hopefully. I mean, hopefully they will give back to the community if they discover anything. So I guess that's a hopefully overall positive, but it's hard to say right now, of course, and we will find out when we find out. This is all part of DARPA's Social Cyber, which is a rather strange name, program, 18 months long, which doesn't seem that much. Multi-billion-dollar though, I don't know. That seems like a lot of money to get through in 18 months. Combining sociology, and the human is usually the weakest link, technology, AI-powered learning, of course, to map out all of these connections to the kernel and other projects that sort of connect to it to see what those potential vulnerabilities and exploits could be in the future. Interesting, maybe. I'm not sure if there's going to be more details of that program, but have a look and we'll keep an eye on it. In related news, Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, has two releases. Oh, well, they're kind of one and the same, but connected, coming out. And this is the latest version of Ubuntu and some other packages around it. So Ubuntu 23.10 will be Mantic Minotaur, and it has quite a cool looking desktop background with a kind of Minotaur's face in a maze, which is, it could have been a mazed Minotaur, something like that. I'm not entirely sure what Mantic even means, but anyway, it's quite a cool little logo. I played around with it a little bit on some of the betas. There's some updates to the App Center, a couple of GNOME updates, and a few other behind the scenes updates to make containerized workflows more secure and also and more accessible, and tie up a few security issues around namespaces and things like that. Also, full disk encryption at a hardware level if you have hardware to support it, which is a little hard to test, and a lot of that hardware support will be rolling out over time, but really focusing on. It's always the interesting thing with something like Ubuntu, because some people, especially myself, will encounter it through the desktop version, but then really a lot of these features tend to be aimed at server users. And apart from app discovery in the App Center, which I dug around a little bit, and it's very nice, but I'm not sure how many people use it, because there's not many. They have this whole kind of rating and review system, but not many people really seem to use it. I found quite a lot of packages that they promote themselves as featured, and they were not particularly up-to-date versions. And things like Docker, for example, if you installed a version from the center, it's not the correct version. These sorts of perennial Linux problems are not really resolved by the new App Center, but it looks nice, that's for sure. Certainly for your everyday user, I think it's a good starting point. It's also supported on new Raspberry Pi and a few other related, should we call them micro systems, and deeper integration with familiar administrative tools, which is possibly something that's important. I've worked in a couple of mixed environments where administrators want you to use certain packages and plugins to ensure compliance, and Linux is usually not allowed because there are no real compliance tools. Whether this will mean that this is now in availability remains to be seen. I guess it depends on what kind of contract that some of these companies are paid into and whether they're going to want to switch anytime soon. But it's a step in the right direction, I suppose, to allow Linux, macOS, Windows, mixed environments to all enjoy/suffer a kind of administrative unity across that company. Another announcement from Canonical from a few weeks ago now. This is Charmed ML Flow. What is Charmed LM Flow? Charmed often is Canonical's way of signifying that a package is kind of enterprise ready and supported, that kind of thing. I've featured a couple of interviews with some product managers from Canonical on some of their other projects, names that are escaping me now. I think Kubeflow might be one of them. I can't quite remember. I'm not even entirely sure if this may have merged into ML Flow. What is ML Flow? It's part of Canonical's growing ML Ops portfolio. What is ML Ops, you may ask? ML Ops is machine learning ops. DevOps has existed with us for some time. We're kind of used to this concept of codified workflows for defining, rolling out, rolling back, maintaining, reviewing developer releases, developer workflows, infrastructure, etc. Machine learning models have lagged behind a little bit, but with the recent proliferation and popularity of machine learning models, a lot of projects and options have been emerging to allow similar-ish workflows. And Charmed ML Flow is one of those. I may give it a go in a hands-on video at some point in the future, but I'm not completely sure when. It'll be something I sort of need a fairly solid use case to test properly, kick the tires on. But if you're looking for a solution and you're already kind of in the Canonical ecosystem, if there is such a thing in the Linux world, I guess there is, then take a look. And it can be used not only on servers, but also on your local desktop for quick experimentation. Fully tested on Ubuntu, of course, Windows subsystem, and apparently other operating systems with multipass, which is Canonical's kind of, it's not really a Kubernetes Minikube kind of alternative, but it lets you run virtual machines on other operating systems. I have used it on Mac a few times. I'm never completely sure why I would use it versus something else, but it's a relatively tidy way of experimenting, especially with Ubuntu and other Canonical related products. So it might be the best way to experiment if you are a Mac user, for example. So when I get around to it, it's probably the path I will follow. And if you want to find out more about it, Canonical are having an AI roadshow, started a few weeks ago, but running until the 7th of December, all across the world, mostly America, Europe, and the Middle East, but you may find one near you at some point soon. So head on over to the Canonical website or just type that into a search engine to find out more and find out more. Continuing with open source, this is another article from MIT Technology Review. What can I say? They've been knocking out the park recently. Will Douglas Heaven, the open source AI boom is built on big tech's handouts. How long will it last? I think you could possibly add this headline to the open source boom from the past few years was also built on big tech handouts, but I guess the cycle is much quicker in this case because we have seen such a big uptick in AI-based applications and services that rely on stand on the shoulders of giants. That's the phrase I'm looking for. And many of those giants were research and models and frameworks and tools all built by larger companies that they then release. It's open source. Meta, OpenAI, and a few others, but they're the two main ones. And many companies are now making quite good money out of leveraging that. And you could, of course, argue that's the same with open source going back a while. But I think the boom in AI coincides with the bust in tech and SaaS and open source generally at the moment. So that cycle of companies questioning whether this is good business practice is happening much quicker. And you're already seeing OpenAI starting to change its policies around what it releases. Meta is probably the next largest company that is still releasing free and open source, but you wonder how much longer that will last. I guess it's also not really their business. They don't. It's like React and many other things that Meta has released. That is not how they make money. Whereas with OpenAI, it is. So they're effectively giving free tools to the competition. Meta doesn't really have that issue. Google is another company that we may see changes from in the future. And there's a couple of others in there, ones that surprised me actually, like Dolly, which actually came from Databricks, who have been around the open source world for a while, and then a few others from more recent companies. But yeah, with other changes in open source licensing and funding models over the past few months, I guess we'll see what happens with all this research and whether it continues to flow into other companies' coffers. I feel like this is something of a cliche, but we will see. On the subject of licensing changes and funding model changes, this has been something playing out over the last few weeks. I'm referring specifically to an article here on GameDeveloper.com by Brandon Sheffield, and actually this predates even more recent changes. This is the death of Unity, once heralded as the savior of the video game industry. And they received a bit of a leg up recently with Apple announcing support for its Vision Pro with it, but then they really set the cat amongst the pigeons, or specifically, shall we say, their CEO, John Riticello, really upsetting people quite a lot over the past few years, but especially in the past few weeks, around how they changed their funding model. I won't go into too much detail, but to suffice it to say, it really stung a lot of game studios, small and large. And I think I saw or heard some statistics around how some free-to-play games, for example, would end up losing money because of the way it works. Things like bundles, which you often see on Steam, and Humble Bundle wouldn't really work anymore because Unity would demand payments for each copy, quote-unquote, sold in this case. This has all turned around in the past day or so. I haven't really caught up, but John Riticello is out and the previous CEO is back. And much like many other controversial statements that have really upset communities over the past couple of years, maybe they will reverse a lot of that. Will they value providing a business that people like over more business? That's, of course, it's an argument whether that would have been the case, but I guess that's what they assumed that would happen in the long run. And now everything is back to normal. Who knows? We'll see. Don't actually know the answer to that question yet, because as I'm recording, that is when things just changed. So it's yet another case of we will see. And most news is like that, isn't it, really? But especially this episode. Next, quite an interesting, not really a deep dive, but a dive nonetheless by Adi Osmani on Adobe's Medium about how they have brought Photoshop to the web. This has been happening a little bit over time. I think I've covered previous somewhat related content on the subject about how Adobe have been using WASM to take some of their C++ and C code from Photoshop into web. And I think a couple of us more than a couple of us have played around with various iterations of this over the recent months. And it works surprisingly well. And you're starting to see this actually kind of work both ways in Photoshop. More web elements in the desktop application and more sort of quote-unquote native components in the web application. What's it all leading to? I really hope Adobe are not going to put everything on the web, because that would be quite disappointing. But it does really open up that flow, which I really see the company pushing for at the moment, between And you're seeing this with recent releases of Photoshop and other tools in the Creative Suite, where you can create something in the desktop application, share it for collaboration or comment, and people in the desktop application, or increasingly so on the web, can comment, can make tweaks maybe. I'm not really sure. I haven't really had the need to go through the process yet. And then maybe you see those comments in the desktop application, that kind of thing. Of course, the concept is not new, but in an applications, the complexity of some of Adobe's, it possibly is somewhat newer. And in recent years, they also acquired Frame.io, which does this in the video, so in Premiere as well. And I think they're also allowing it now in Audition, although it lacks some of the features, of course, because there's no visual component. But it's interesting to see how the Adobe is really rolling out a lot of these cross-platform connections between their products and how people work with them collaboratively, but not just their products. Like using something on the web can also be used by someone who doesn't even have a Creative Cloud account or subscription. So, sharing with clients and things like that. And I especially use Frame, for example, like that quite a lot to get feedback on edits I'm making for people or interviews, et cetera, before releasing them. So it's interesting to see. And they go into a little bit of detail about how they are accomplishing some of this. In related, talking about sort of cross-platform uniformity, consistency, well, this was the release of Sonoma on macOS and iOS 17, iPadOS 17, etc., etc. And this has been covered fairly extensively. I'm always a bit too late to do my own roundups when there's plenty of other people like 6 Colors, 512 Pixels, Mac Stories, etc., who do much better jobs than I ever could. But I have actually been enjoying seeing how the various aspects, and I only see 2 of those through macOS and iPadOS, are starting to synchronize. You see these things like widgets and focus modes and mail accounts and all these sorts of things where, there's always been this concept of Apple's walled garden, but sometimes that walled garden had a few holes in the wall. But it's getting really, really good. And I come from a time of using Apple and Mac products where their sync facilities and features were terrible. You would not trust them. And now to see a company that does it so seamlessly in some cases through iCloud and continuity and all of these various related features, that it works really, really exceptionally well, actually, and sometimes surprising you. And Sonoma has been one of those releases that it's kind of headline-grabbing features, not so sort of astounding, but the more you use it, the more you realize these little small things that are really building up as you use it, like the autocomplete in text fields. That's one of those things where initially it doesn't do very much, and then slowly it starts to get better and better, and I'm finding it very useful. And anything that is sort of part of the system without having to install other third-party tools is kind of nice, and it obviously synchronizes to the iPad and et cetera. Same with the widgets. I haven't really found those massively useful yet, but I may do. And just those little, it's one of those versions that seems to really feel like it improves your productivity as opposed to just giving you new things to mess around with. And there's a few problems here and there, of course. Mail plugins is one. I've lost access to GPG signing in Mail. And that's the main one. I also have an invoicing application I have stopped working and I had to upgrade it. Kind of minor things like this. But generally, it's quite a nice release that is giving those quality of life productivity improvements and not these kind of big headline grabbing features. Although, as is always commented on with things with photos, it adds a lot of new features and you wait eternally for the Photos library to actually give you some of those features. Like I'm waiting for it now recognizes pets. I'm waiting for it to tag all my cat photos and it still hasn't done it yet. And I don't know when it will and I can't manually ask it to. It just does it in its own sweet time. And then I will be able to find pictures of my cat, which is all I really need to do, of course. And finally, from Rest of World, a great roundup of 40 companies that are beating the West. Some of these I'd heard of from all sorts of regions. I've always tried my best to include startups and tech companies from around the world, but it's hard to find them sometimes, especially going to Eastern Europe a lot, which I guess is still the West. And in the coming weeks, I will have a lot of coverage from my trip to Ukraine and IT Arena for the 4th time. But this post goes further into Africa, the Middle East, the edges of Asia, around some of these amazing startups that are huge and you've probably never heard of, especially the ones coming out of places like India. And it's really interesting to go through, and I may use it as a jumping off point to find some people to interview over the coming months, because it's really nice to broaden that market outside of your westernized worldview. And that was my links for the week. A few sponsor notices coming up, but before that, I would like to say again, please, if you listen to the show or if you've ever been on the show, consider sharing this episode or reviewing the podcast wherever you happen to listen to it. That would be very appreciated at the moment as I try to build up the audience. And with that, a few words from our sponsors, and then it's on to my interviews from OSS Summit with Max and Arpit. As always, the usual caveat to apply that it's going to be a little bit noisy in the background, but enjoy.
Next, I'm joined by Max. I'll just go with Max. We had a whole lengthy discussion about it. So, amongst many other things, involved in the tags of a technical advisory group at the CNCF around environmental sustainability.
Correct.
The role there. I'm sure it means sort of lots of volunteers, basically, isn't it? But what do you call yourself?
So the official role would be a co-chair. We have 3 chairs in the tech, which have more like the organizational, administrative perspective on it, right? Thinking about the activities, if they're going alongside with our vision and mission, and if they play also inside the boundaries of the rules of the technical oversight committee. So there's some limited space, right? So we have a focus on cloud native and talking about sustainability and computers. You maybe will come to data centers and cooling, but it's a little bit outside of this boundary. And so we ensure like you move in this right boundary. So it's like I do not want to say control instance. It's less than that, right? It's more like the formal grouping of people who take care about a specific topic that is relevant within the Kubernetes space. So you have, for example, attack security, which, for example, organizes the pen testing of some of the open source tools. Or you have like, let's say, tech application delivery, which takes care about like how we define the delivery of an application towards Kubernetes. What are the methods for it? What are the best practices to it? And so they have different roles. They can be more technical. They can be also more like procedural, like tech contributor strategy, which worry about like how we can keep the open source community engaged and motivated. In former times, because they mentioned it, they were called SIG, Special Interest Group. And I think on the one hand side, it gives actually a better name, like a special interest group says like, they have a special interest, obviously, in some topic, right? But the tech's getting more and more roles to it. So we take care and help projects to grow, which fall maybe into our domain, right? So if you find projects which helps other end users in, I don't know, optimizing their schedule of an application to reduce their carbon footprint, for example, or improve their power and performance consumption, then this would be a project which we would kind of take care of, helping to find contributors, take a look that they're going to the right direction, that they follow somehow the rules and the setup for an open source project under the CNCF.
Down?
So it's actually kind of funny. The tech environmental sustainability was proposed by myself and a colleague of mine. So we wrote a whole proposal through it, actually as a work group, because we said like, okay, tech is maybe too huge, maybe too big. You have this big thing. It sounds scary. Let's start as a work group and let's find out what we want to do and how we really can do it. And so we practically proposed it. There is no very concrete process around it, which can be sometimes a little bit difficult. So you need to find your way and what is it, what isn't it. And so the technical oversight committee, which is like the overall governance board for the technical perspective, reviewed it. We rewrite a little bit the proposal and then they practically vote on just build this work group, right? After several months, there was a decision like, work group is maybe not the right way because actually under a TOC, Technical Oversight Committee, there should be only tags. And then within the tag, we will found work groups for different topics.
Now, I'm going to ask some leading questions because this is actually an area I have done a little bit digging into myself. Last year I worked for an observability company, Scalable. this type of stuff. And they did a talk on making applications, back-end applications, more efficient. So I kind of actually did some digging into this. I think before Kepler became the thing that most people use, I was looking at the ThoughtWorks project.
Cloud Carbon Footprint.
Yeah, which is interesting because it's an extremely big, complicated application. We'll come to maybe the carbon of monitoring application. I showed Kepler yesterday as well. It's like
it's not an easy topic.
Let's come back to that one. Let's on the focus of these days.
Often,
why should we care?
So the thing is actually more like it's a legacy, a heritage, right? The way how we dealt in the past with container, or with servers, better to say. We are very, very bad in utilizing servers. Hypervisors were there to give the first promise and like, look, we have a very large machine, we will utilize it now for everything. But the truth is then you have just minor servers, smaller servers, which are still just a little bit used.
Yep.
So it sums up all the time in this direction. And also with Kubernetes, you can do a lot of stuff wrong. And this is the biggest problem behind it, that you maybe have a good intention, and you maybe do not have enough time to understand it 100%. We often see a lot of people on the market like, oh, we use Kubernetes. But when you dig down, it's like really like the click button deployment. There is very less things happening around like how to schedule your applications better, how to deschedule your applications, how to reduce the size of your server, maybe using a different architecture, right? So the practices behind is just like some thinking about it. And you need to build an evidence between what is running on your server and how big is, for example, the footprint. Can be also cost, it can be also other metrics. This doesn't matter so much. And how I can reduce this if I want to, right? So it's, again, less the problem that there is a problem, but it's more about the heritage of how we deal still with computers and IT. There are for sure the big, very cool tech companies who are driving their infrastructure par excellence. I can't tell them anything about optimizing. They can tell me a lot, right? Because I have tons of use cases. But the truth is that the most enterprises on this planet do not have this 100% tech-focused company, or not companies, but teams, which understands themselves as an IT digital native provider of a service. Right? Most of them come from the background, I'm a service provider for IT, or as IT as a service provider, and deal with it like this. And this is a mental thing, a mindset in it. Yeah.
There's probably an argument as well as saying that a lot of the promises of things like containers and Kubernetes. I think you had the photo of the cow with the wig yesterday.
Yes.
There used to be this analogy of pets and
cattles. Yeah.
And so it became this very disposable idea. It's like, just what containers are. It scales. And I think this is the problem we've hit now, whereas we got used to thinking of everything just being cheap and easy, just throw more resources at it, without really thinking about the repercussions of that.
Yep.
And ironically, as we're having the sustainability conversation, a lot of companies are now need to cut budgets as well, and also want to save money, which inadvertently can save energy too sometimes.
Absolutely.
So now people are starting to think about, actually, there is a repercussion to just throwing more resources at it.
Yeah.
So, I think that was a question. But I think we've now got to a point where we realize we need to be a bit more careful.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, it's like, this is just a repetitive pattern. This is what I mean with the heritage of the legacy which we take, right? We always just throw more in it. And it's for a good cause. But the truth is that many applications are not rewritten to be microservices. Most applications are just like introduced as a state, not most, these are bad words. But what we see in the large enterprises is that critical applications are just a stateful container, which sometimes utilize the whole server, which has a preheat time of 15, 20, 30 minutes. So this is a perspective where like you do something wrong, right? And this is what then people need to understand Kubernetes is maybe not the perfect choice for the problem. Right? Even so, I love Kubernetes and open source, but there's so many use cases where they're like, it doesn't make sense. You need to change before you can use this tech. Right? You don't change because you use the tech. Yeah. This is the difference. Yeah. You have to change first to adopt it, not adopt it and then change.
So in the context of the tag, I think you said yesterday that you're not consultants, you're an advisory group. What are the advisories you give to do something?
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple in passing, but what are some of the things you consider in your architecture, in your infrastructure planning, etc., to help?
So this is a very interesting aspect because it's so fast moving, and like I always say, like if I would talk about this topic last year, my answers would be completely different, right? Because there continuously changes in it. And I think we have like maybe 3 or 4 perspectives on it. The one hand side, it's always about first gain transparency, because if you're not aware of what you have and what is your current situation, then you have a problem of acting on it. So this is always about this measure part, understanding where's the application running, how big is my carbon footprint. If you know this already, you're far ahead than the most people on the market. But it's very, very important. So we can advise here or give a direction like how you can measure it, what you can see, what you can learn from it, how to interpret it, this number. The next step is looking onto your infrastructure. There are simple and easy changes, and there are very large changes which you can apply to. The thing is, we currently take a look of collecting best practices for it and saying like, okay, this change will have that cost, right? We're talking about optimized operating systems, for example, for the nodes, but also for the containers. We're looking into stuff like WebAssembly. It is faster. Okay, it runs way more closer to the core of the system. Okay, fine. But does the resource utilization during the runtime and execution of a process, is it really more efficient? Or doesn't the software just behave the same? So there are things which we look into and try to find out ourselves.
Those between data centers, I mean, CDNs and things like that are fairly well established processes, but a bit more. I think all the major cloud vendors now offer various regions.
Yeah.
Anyway, unfortunately, they often cost a lot, which is a shame. But and now, is there ever going to be like some mechanism inside Kubernetes configuration that you could actually kind of do it like Kubernetes needs to? Put these pods, this service in the most not just I want these CPUs and memory footprint, but I also want the environmental footprint below this.
Yeah.
And this payload, well, that's more mission critical, so that can do what it likes.
No, I think we will get there. So the Green Software Foundation does a lot of activities in this direction. It's very much centric around Azure, because Microsoft is supporting it. So it always works best if you consider Azure as your cloud hoster for this topic. Doesn't mean not necessarily that the data center have the best footprint, but it will work best to shift your workload. So there's the Carbon Aware SDK, which you can build in your own stuff, but also like the KEDA, the Kubernetes event-driven autoscaler, has implemented the Carbon Aware SDK. Right? So you can utilize this and think about to schedule that way, which is perfectly fine. But you can also do a little bit like the cheaper version of it, the quote-unquote cheaper version, which would be like using Carpenter, more on the AWS side, where you can say like this kind of workload, I prefer to run in that data center. It's then not that much carbon aware, but again, it's like, let's have this interview in a year again, and maybe we'll tell you a different story, right? So because it's currently happening and it's currently going on that this is implemented and being developed. But besides this, there's also like a lot of other things which you can consider. I had recently a discussion with an enterprise architect and said like, how much do you consider the location of your data center, the cycle of your application, like the workload cycle over the day of your application, and the weather forecast? And he was like, and he was like, well, I don't really consider. And I was like, well, but you told me that sustainability is your top 2 priority. So why don't you consider? And I was like, well, I never thought about that this is related. But it's like, yeah, well, but it is, right? And the problem is that this topic gets then a little bit too complicated because exactly you would need, but that's a problem, right? You would need to understand for a region where your data center is, what is the energy mix which is available, and how does this energy mix is built up? Is it solar? Is it wind? Is it water? Is it nuclear, gas, whatsoever? So it's kind of complicated. It's not a
You have to have your data.
Yeah, exactly.
This kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And probably that one trumps the other.
And that's why I love this topic. I not just only love this topic because of the sustainable factor itself, but because it is a challenge to find the right thing to put everything together that it makes sense, right? You have also a lot of considerations. There's actually two kind of funny things in it. The one's considerations like, oh, move your compute time with the sun, for example. Like literally follow the sun.
Yeah.
It's like, it is a good idea. I understand where it comes from, but does every country have solar panels? Maybe not. Because it's expensive and it needs to have some incubation from the government that it's happening. So maybe this is not the case. Second, you can move your processing. Can you move your data?
Yeah.
Moving a gigabyte, fine, I don't discuss. Moving 100 gigabyte, let's give the calculator. Moving terabytes, or in some cases, when we take a look in companies who collect globally petabytes of data week over week, I can't move it. Well, I can, but the process of moving will take already too much time. And it has a very big environmental footprint. There's a reason why networking is so costly.
Yeah.
On the one hand side, because network itself is a very cost-intensive installation. Looking into data centers from cloud providers, it's, I think, was the most complex thing which they have in there, right? Because everything what you can configure in your software can happen or is already happening on the hardware side. So it's getting quite complicated. And the other effect is that it needs a lot of energy because you have so many components within the network to transfer data that it's also costly for this. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So let's come back to the monitoring itself. Mm-hmm. I mentioned briefly this ThoughtWorks cloud carbon footprint.
Yep.
You mentioned Kepler, and you can also just do your own.
There's many ways. Yeah.
It's interesting to know because most of those two especially are quite heavy in themselves in the grand scheme of, I don't know, website, for example. Mm-hmm. The amount of traffic and overhead it has adding on this service just to monitor that probably is very minimal, really, in the grand scheme of things. But are there any efforts to make even more efficient monitoring? Like I could think doing things like eBPF.
So eBPF, Kepler is based on eBPF.
I haven't seen that yet.
The thing is what makes it so heavy is that Kepler has also a machine learning part in itself. You also have Grafana for showing the dashboards, but Grafana is actually lightweight. You also run some Prometheus exporter and stuff like that. So the thing is Kepler is complicated and heavy because it has many parts in it. But it would be nice to have a light version of it or an agent version of it. Maybe that's something for the future. I don't know. The Intel and Red Hat folks are actively contributing on this and keep developing it. I mean, the very special part about Kepler is that it's able to understand the workload in Kubernetes and matches the energy consumption which each of the workloads has. If you're looking into tools like Scafandre, which is a French and not container-oriented version of Kepler, I think not running on eBPF, but maybe I'm also wrong, they focus on the virtual machines. Right? And they are way more lightweighted. But they cannot split then the information. So you would need to do the math by yourself, and then you start scripting, building operator, whatsoever. Then you also get the complexity on top of it. However, the thing is some of the commercial tools already can do this quite well. I don't know, for example, Dynatrace can get this information. They have a carbon impact tool. Yep. It's yet very high level, but at least on data center and server, it can show you already your footprint. Yeah. For example. So there's a couple of options in it.
It's interesting actually because say I spent 2.5 years working for an observability company and got to know a lot of the people in that space. Mm-hmm. Even though those metrics are kind of there to extrapolate, really focus on it, I suppose, because it's not a business priority. It wasn't a business priority then.
Yeah.
Maybe now. And I suppose if it's Prometheus, into maybe a final question around this is, we already see that potentially, especially in Europe, there may be regulation around software security supply chains, things like that. Do you foresee a time where, let's take Europe as an example, we're in Europe, we're both European, it's sort of probably the place we know best anyway. At least in the European Union where they like to regulate things, there might be a kind of your application infrastructure have to like you see on consumer goods, the
Yeah.
A to
Yeah.
E, like you go to a website and there's an imprint somewhere that says, this website is D-rated.
Yeah.
And there'll be mandates to do something like that, or is it too complicated? I don't know.
No, I don't. Well, it will take some time.
Yeah.
It is yet complicated, but I mean, the thing with the European rules is sometimes they're very dumb and very high level, but to fulfill them, it's a long road, right?
Yeah.
So on a paper, it's easy to fulfill it, but if you really, really wants to do it seriously, that's getting complicated.
Especially with computing, because
So, I mean, like they have changed the reporting guidelines for enterprises in Europe, not only for enterprises, but for large companies. And you have now your bank statements, but you also need to do non-financial statements. And one part of the reporting of non-financial statements, I believe it's active from next year, January, is also an ESG report. And they're more or less precise on the ESG report. So they need to give their footprint overall, right? So for the most companies, let's look into manufacturing, for example, which have large data centers by themselves. Well, they have a big electricity counter, right? And then they give a call to their favorite energy provider and get their energy mix, and then most likely they will get something out of it. So on this level, there's already the first steps going on. And there's also this taxonomy guideline or framework for Europe, which is a little bit more precise, which says like, okay, you need to explain how you have measured, what are the factors which is relevant for those numbers. So you need to understand it practically, right? It's like the beautiful difference of like driving a car and understanding the car and what it's doing, being able to repair by yourself. So,
you're from Bavaria, yeah?
No, I live in Bavaria, but I'm proudly not from Bavaria. it's a big thing, right? I mean, but automotive overall in Germany is a very, very big thing. And I mean, then there's also like in kind of ESG ISO certificate 100, let me lie, 1 or 2 or something like that. But it's also not very precise or specific in it. So there is already a lot of stuff going on in this direction. And as far as I know, the Green Software Foundation is right now in the process of getting the software carbon intensity specification as an ISO standard.
Yeah.
Right? And I think this could be the next step. It maybe will not ask everyone to do it. I don't think so. But it can play all together. In Germany, we have this Blue Angel certificate for also sustainability factors. And if you would like to implement this very, very precisely, then you need to dig down on your IT.
Right.
No, because you're not forced to have it.
Yeah.
Right. If your consumers are interested that you have the certificate, then it's relevant.
It's a water brand. I see it on a lot.
It comes from this, right?
Yeah.
Because it's actually about water pollution. And if you run your own data centers, you have a lot of water pollution too. It's not about only CO2.
Yeah.
So from this perspective, it plays a role, but it's extending its footprint. Because the thing is, it is very precise in asking you like what you have to show and display in order to get it. Right? And so I don't think that it will be a very good international standard because it's very much too Germanized and too bureaucratic and whatsoever. But it could be a good blueprint to build on and say like, okay, there's a lot of things which you have to understand and put together and need to document. You need to have process around and this and that and that. Would make a good foundation for a way larger standard. Finding definitively more contributing people. And I think at the moment we have two big things on our plate. The one thing is to implement some sort of infrastructure, helping the open source software within the CNCF landscape to measure their own software carbon intensity footprint and report this and make this visible. Because if you have this per project, then you can see between releases if the software is getting better or not. Yeah. So this could be helpful because sustainability is more about raising the awareness, not about like running around and telling people they're destroying the world. Right? This is the totally wrong thing.
I used to work in the environmental sector in Australia. We learned this.
Yeah. And the other large thing is like we will have in October the Environmental Sustainability Week, the Cloud Native Environmental Sustainability Week, which is like a full week of global meetups. I have to take a look. I can tell you later.
I'd be interested in hopefully attending, but unfortunately I have a few trips to confirm, so hopefully it's not one of those weeks.
So when you go to our website, sustainability.cncf.io also, or .com, or org, I'm not sure. too many domains. there we have our own tab for it because it's like 30 events happening in US, North and South, a lot in Europe and in Asia. I think Africa and Australia don't have yet events, but but these events it's a very large project because the reason is it's the Earth Week, right? And then it ends with the Earth Day, so that's why we're doing it. Yeah, somewhere. I think around the 18th or something. Like I'm not sure. And this is like a very big global effort because we don't organize the meetups per country, but we have all the volunteers around the globe who are organizing it. And then you have similar questions like what slides we should show, how we should structure it, does it cost something, who takes food, sponsorship, blah, blah, blah. So we try to give the foundation for it. And if we know someone, we try to link the people up. But luckily enough, we have a lot of people within the community who come already from major brands. And they are happy to sponsor a few $100s. It's not that much to make this sustainability day happening. Yeah. I think the only thing is to make people more aware that it is happening and bring more people to the event itself. Yeah. Because otherwise, if you sit with 5 people, it's fantastic. You can have a nice conversation. But it feels maybe small and you would like to have like 10, 15 more people, you can do one. Yeah. The base materials are provided by us. The rest is up to you. We see all kinds of things. Like some people find talks, right? In Munich, where a colleague of mine and myself is organizing it. We even have the end user who's reporting from their side and their research and experience on this topic, which I love because that's always a very nice perspective and way better discussion ground than like theoretically whatever. We see unconferences, right? Like people can throw their topics onto the table and everyone votes and then let's sit together and discuss. So there's plenty of opportunities to get creative around it.
Now I'm joined by Arpit Joshipura of so Linux Foundation has many subgroups, and you are, what's your title of which one? I sort of know the vague terms, but maybe we should get it from the source.
So Arpit Joshipura, I head up sub-foundations like networking, edge, energy. So let me explain how Linux Foundation is set up. We have the overall nonprofit, and within that, we have multiple sub-foundations that either address a technology area like blockchain or things like that, or address market-specific technologies, right? Whether it's energy, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's film industry, whether it's finance, banking, agriculture, etc. And these are all sub-foundations that are run separately to solve single most important problem, which is open source innovation. So me particularly, I head up the LF Energy, LF Networking, LF Edge, and LF Connectivity, among other sub-foundations.
It's interesting because energy is a broad subject, but once you start to bring in those other topics like edge and connectivity, it starts to maybe become a bit clearer, more specifically, what the LF Energy Group is looking at and taking care of. But there's been a lot of discussion at the moment around energy usage in computing generally, but I think the energy subgroup is mostly focusing on the infrastructure side, I think, or is it a bit broader than that?
It is broader than that. But before we understand how the energy market is evolving, you've got to understand where it comes from. Okay. So we're talking 100+ years old industries. Okay. Energy, telecommunications, banking, automotives. These are 100+ year old industries. And they've always been used to deploying proprietary solutions, completely integrated hardware and software with extremely high dependencies on standards and regulations. That's the industries, right, that we are talking about. In the last 10 years, we've seen these industries move to accelerate innovation. And how did they do that? Using open source. Okay. So telecommunications was the first to embark on this journey. It started off by disaggregation, right? Meaning separating hardware and software, and then allowing open source to be that layer of software where the global community innovates and gets you services faster. So you can see how quickly we are getting all the mobile services or voice services or all the apps that come onto a telecommunications network. It's all because of open source innovation, right? Energy is right behind that industry. Yeah. It's about, I would say, 3 to 5 years behind, but it is very quickly catching up. And it is following the same path. And to answer your question, where the focus is, it is on the distribution and the generation, it is on transmission, it is on edge, and it's on all of the what we call end-to-end systems that need to talk to each other. And let me explain the analogy a little bit more in detail, if you may. The innovation needed to be speeded up, and the networks wanted to be dynamic. Why? Because if you remember, 10 years ago, we would just go to a website and consume content, right? So the traffic was predictable, everything was good. And then came smartphones, user-generated content. All of a sudden, content came from anybody, anywhere. And dynamically, the networks had to adjust. So there's a technology called orchestration, right? That was created to, literally orchestrate the network so that they can actually use these services. Okay. The exact same thing has happened in energy. We used to consume energy in our houses or in our businesses, and it was a predictable demand and load on the grid. All of a sudden, you got alternative energies getting created and sent to the grid. The consumption patterns are varying because of, charging and charging stations and solar energy and wind energy. So all of a sudden, the entire infrastructure needs a mechanism to orchestrate and dynamically manage, right? That's what LF Energy gives you. There are about 25 projects. I won't go into the details of all, but you get the concept of why this has become so important.
So on a more general level, you mentioned communications, and I think one of the big advances there from a software perspective is things like software-defined networks. And so are there now software-defined energy grids and power stations? Is that kind of where it's going? Or
good analogy, and the answer is yes. We don't call it that, but software-defined networks are essentially saying you're separating hardware from software. You're separating control plane from data plane, meaning for the traffic management, you want to send the payload separately from where the payload goes, right? That's the general concept of SDN. And in the only difference is, this is energy and this is like electricity versus the other ones are packets, right? But effectively, the entire network of energy generation, distribution, transmission, the whole thing, right, is becoming software-centric. And you have to make it software-centric to allow for these alternative ways of creating, generating, and distributing network energy. And using open source to do it is the only way to speed up the innovation. Yeah.
Can we just focus on the creating for a moment? Because I would imagine that's the one part that is still very analog and traditional. I don't know how much kind of smarts can you inject in coal and hydroelectricity? When it's still, in my mind, it feels very analog still, but maybe it's smarter than I think it is. And these images of dark power stations churning out smoke is maybe not as accurate as it once was. I don't know.
So from our perspective, LF Energy's perspective, I want to stay out of domains we don't influence. Okay, that's correct. So the means by which energy is created is not something we can influence. Okay, the connectivity, the distribution, the orchestration, the commonality of software that we influence, right? So we do have projects that have common way of sending data or utility information or generating credits or even charging, for example, like frameworks for general charging stations and things like that we influence. We, of course, we have opinions about the ways we can generate, but that's not the focus of LF Energy, right? Just to be very clear.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So if there's no interactivity on the that end of the funnel, how far down would it go as a consumer when I get my bills, for example? Is there likely to be too much interaction with anything that the Linux Foundation has played a part in there, or is it sort of more in the middle between those two ends?
I think starting with so of course the billing is an application that the utilities like local utilities have, and that's not standardized, right, by any means, right? Whether you're in Europe or US, in fact, the entire utility market or the energy grid operators and everybody is very localized, as we know, right? And we don't influence how they run their applications. But the moment that hits the central point where they can share information, they can build what I call the plumbing layer of software, right? Common things. That starts impacting the way they build these systems, right? So we, does LF Energy influence billing? Not directly, but indirectly it does, right? Because you expose APIs, you expose credits, you expose a lot of these parameters back in
a way that the telecommunications business ended up with a lot of the MVNs or MVVNs, whatever they're called. Yeah. I'm guessing now I live in Germany, which is fairly regulated from an energy sector, but there's a couple of equivalents now there that I think are piggybacking on the back of the bigger companies, but offer the sort of month-to-month flexible billing, this kind of thing. So I'm supposing that some of those efforts have allowed that kind of level for the consumer as well.
Yeah. And I think more than the consumer also, right, you got to look at the operators, the DSOs, the ISOs, right? They are the ones that actually benefit from the work we do. And they are actually participating in the community, right? So the way LF Energy works is we host projects, right? So LF hosts these projects. There are more than 25 projects. A project is obviously a collection of hardware, software, APIs, documentation, everything. And it's an open source project. So we host projects and then we run the community, meaning, we do the R&D operations, program management, etc. Then those projects produce code. That code gets integrated, tested by the community, used by these utilities like an RTE or an Alliander or anybody in US, right? And then if they want to make changes, they can actually submit code back in, right? So that's our job, right? Which is grow the community and keep adding to these projects and keep adding deployments and users to the community to sort of get it going.
And the group has recently had a couple of events, I think. There was one in Paris, and I think there was one in the US as well recently, I think.
Prague.
Oh, Prague, okay. That's a lot closer than Paris. I should have gone to that one. So what are some of the discussions and topics happening there? I know some of the subjects I've seen on the emails, etc., but what are some of the areas that people are most interested in the projects that the group is hosting?
So there are three themes emerging. Okay, the first theme is the general awareness of the rest of the world. So in energy, Europe, and I would say not energy, but in open source energy, Europe is leading the world in a good way and a bad way. Bad way because there's energy crisis here more than everywhere else in the world. But the good way is they are leading the open source foundations, right? Our chair of LF Energy is from RT, right? French utility. Now, given that, so the first main theme is how do you expand the scope of work and the global community beyond just the European-centric operators, okay, or utility providers? And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to get the Department of Energy in US, getting all the grid operators. There's like 17 plus different entities we need to work with. They don't compete, which is great, but then they don't collaborate also all the time. So we have to get all of them on board. We've been talking to the China grid people to try and the crisis there is even worse. So they are very interested. So that's the first theme, right? Which is how do we expand globally? Because open source is all about global collaboration, right? There's no, it's not a area specific thing we do. So that's the first theme. The second is how do we grow our projects, which is again infrastructure all the way to applications, right? If you look at the software stack, and then if you look at the physical thing, you got distribution, transmissions, edge, and things like that. So that is kind of our second big focus. What are the use cases and what are the areas that are important that we don't have software for, right? And where are our end users hurting the most? So there's, and there are mechanisms like the TSC and the TAC within our community, which are Technical Steering Committee, Technical Advisory Council, which are basically a bunch of very smart people who figure out where we should be going, right? So that's the second. And then the third very interesting focus area is the interdependency and the collaboration across industries, right? So a lot of the utilities in US have bought a private 5G network for their control of the substations, right? So now you have telecom and energy working together to try and orchestrate one another, right? How do we get that dependency worked out? The other area where there's cross collaboration is edge and IoT with the energy industry, right? So we have projects that cross the two, like there's a project called Fledge, which is hosted by our sister foundation called LF Edge, but it is customized to implement in the energy environment as an edge project. Yeah. Okay. So, and then what does that mean? That means you are now providing frameworks for edge computing and IoT for your meters or for your transmission equipment or for your any of the constrained edge devices that are used in the energy subsystems. Yeah. Okay, so those are the top three, right? Like, global expansion, project expansion, and then cross vertical expansion.
From your perspective, and depending on the country you're in, there's been conversation for a while on topics like smart grid and smart metering and things like that. Do you have much interaction with those? And if so, do you think they're finally going to be useful to people? Or, it depends on the country. So
smart grids are not a new concept, right? But they are being extremely well documented and people know what to do. And we are hosting projects like, Power Grid, and there are some other smart grid projects. You can look it up on the website that are actually solving that particular use case, right? In terms of, and it's not like one project is going to solve it all, right? Like how a smart grid works, there are layers that you have to peel and then, address some of these problems. Yeah.
And let's sort of abstract into the Linux Foundation now has so many things. Maybe that's just a statement we can make. But fundamentally, it was born out of this aspect of a sort of hacker culture that became something much bigger and broader. There's been this dream that things like microgrids and feeding into networks and things of almost people having their own self-sustainability for power. Do you see that as anything possible in using some of your projects in the nearish future for some people in some countries, depending on the regulation, of course?
Okay, so I think if we take it broader, Linux Foundation has really stepped up its effort on the sustainability work, right? Yeah. We just published multiple reports on sustainability, including the one from UN's response, right, on each of the groups that we play in and play a part in. And I think it's very eye-opening because there are multiple dimensions to it. Energy is one dimension. Agriculture is the other dimension. Climate is the other dimension. So we have, OS Climate, LF Energy, LF Ag. All of the networking projects have an energy component to it, right? Like about 3 to 5% of global energy consumptions is is part of the mobile connectivity, right? So that is significant if you even knock it off by 1%. So there's a green base station or a green, right? There's a lot of those things happening. Agriculture has the other vertical that focuses on that. So at the LF level, Linux Foundation level, while we have our roots in Linux, it started off at, we have grown in the last 20 years to expand beyond Linux into all of these markets. And a lot of these markets have influence into the overall sustainability goals, right? And the mission that we want to accomplish to go for a greener planet.
And on that, I think the energy group is looking more at the distribution, the infrastructure of energy distribution. But there's some other foundations looking at other aspects of energy and sustainable computing generally, like I think the Sustainable Web Foundation, the Green Energy Foundation, sustainable computing, maybe. Sometimes you can't quite remember if they're one or the same. Do you have much overlap with any of those, or is that you're sort of dealing with the industry side enough to maybe not really step into their territory so much?
I think there are, let's put it this way, there are a lot of foundations looking globally at sustainability. My personal opinion is there will never be enough. Okay. And I would encourage everybody to, if you want to focus and help us, go for it. Doesn't have to be LF. It can be outside the LF. There is probably the area and the dimension is so vast that I hardly see any overlaps. Okay. For example, every one of us plays a part in it, right? Like from the recycling industry, which we don't influence, to the ocean and mining, to the generation, right? There are all these that have a sustainability angle. All the IT firms, all of the top 10,000 tech companies, they have a sustainability goal that they have to meet. And then all the verticals have a goal, right? And one of them happens to be energy, right? One of them happens to be agriculture. One of them happens to be telecom. And we just want to make sure that all of these markets have common, like at the end of the day, my thinking is very simple, right? If you repeat areas of software, if you repeat, meaning if you redo areas of software that are non-differentiated again and again, you're wasting people's time, energy, the compute cycles to run the load. Basically you're just, doing work for no reason. So that's what LF is so good about, right? Which is the plumbing layer. Common non-differentiated software should be done once globally by everybody in all industries and shared. And that itself is a great goal for sustainability, right?
So there's a final question. I mean, you've touched upon it yourself a little bit so far, but I think we know that energy, sustainability of energy in every way that means, is going to be big topics in the next, foreseeable future. So 6 months may be too short to say, but what do you think will be some of the big developments or on the roadmap effectively for the group in the next 6 months to a year based around those issues that I think are going to be becoming much more apparent? And you talked about Europe. I think it tends to sometimes be ahead in topics like this because of its just desire to create more regulation than the US maybe, which is good and bad. But what do you see as some of the developments you'll be working on in the next 6 months or so that are, probably fairly important, I guess?
So as I said, we're still in the early phase of the open sourceification of energy sector. Okay. And I call it open sourceification because it's kind of a unique word where we are using open source technologies and common shared practices to speed up innovation, right? So that's kind of what we are going to do now. So that's continuing. I think what I'm starting to see is the US is stepping up its game big time, especially the US Department of Energy and, a lot of associated ARPA-E, and there are projects, right? So we've been talking about that, and they are stepping up. They're partnering with the Linux Foundation to, make everything open, right? Because energy and the grid is a critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure needs to be secure. And the only way to secure all of the critical infrastructure is using open source code. Right. So that's why I'm saying the most important thing next is focus on security and focus on open source security, because there are some best practices. So our sister foundation, OpenSSF, has provided guidelines on what does secure open source mean. And LF Energy is following all of those very effectively. So that's kind of the big area, which is like two big areas, right? Continue with the global expansion and awareness that this is important for the future of the planet. Second, security, and making sure that as we move to open source, the grids are secure, the software is secure, and the regulatory and the government agencies are aware and they know what the right way to do it is. Now, I'm not arguing for more regulations or less. Okay, that's kind of a country-specific things. But the regional strategies are slightly different, right? Europe does tend to kind of try and regulate more. US tends to deregulate, but more importantly, they align energies to, no pun intended, but they align their energy to open up the system and the competition, but using common frameworks like LF's framework, right? So they have a different strategy than just keeping on regulating the industry. And then we're starting to see the third big thing is, India and China will step up their game on sustainability. We're already in early talks with both of them in terms of how we can help. So those are the big things that we see in the next 1 year, 2 years.
India and China sounds like the big
Yeah.
Two of the biggest countries in the world.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on, and we're in active dialogue. So, okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And those are my interviews from Open Source Summit with Max and Arpit, talking all things open source, Linux Foundation, CNCF, energy and sustainability, especially with the activities from the sustainability tag. Keep an eye out on their website, which I will include in the show notes once I figure out what it is myself, for their activities coming up over the next few weeks, which is why I wanted to get those out soon. I have a few more interviews coming up around similar subjects as well, actually. It's something I've been digging into quite a lot. Amongst all that, I have been in hyper catch-up mode after being away for several weeks. Lots and lots of interviews not in the can, because I haven't done anything with them yet, but to be put in the can. I don't know if that's the right word, but it'll do. So not massive amount from me. Right now, I have a few things that are nearly done. I think the only real thing was there was a blog post version of my digitizing music PDFs, which is up on Medium now. I did a little bit of a channel intro video on YouTube, but you probably don't really need to see that. And I have an update to a Run Me video, which I covered a few months back, coming soon, and a few shorts I'm going to be putting out soon as well. I think those are the main things for now. I've been doing a lot of updates to my website, so you can find various bits of content that I haven't told anyone about appearing on there over the next few weeks. And I think I will leave it there. I think my only calls to action, apart from heading over to wherever you are listening to review, would be also head on over to chrischinchilla.com/support. I've put a very work in progress page there of all the ways you can also support what I do through various kind of donations and subscriptions at different levels. I'm trying to provide a very affordable option for everybody. I know a lot of creators at the moment are talking about the price of a coffee. It was like $7, $8, $9. I don't know where people get their coffee from. This doesn't cost that much in Berlin. But I just want to try and provide options for as much as you can, recurring or one-offs. Everything is helpful to keep things going. And I'm sort of soft launching a few programs there that you can take a look at. Things like Patreon, Ko-fi, buy me a coffee, etc., etc. They're all on there, and I haven't done a tremendous amount with them yet, but they are there. And it will also bring you into the Discord server, which I always mention, but that's starting to sort of take shape as well. I'll be back probably in the next week or so with many more interviews from Open Source Summit plus other things. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining me, and take care, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at chrischinchilla.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions and helping me produce my shows and work.